Welcome to our breakdown of a recent episode from the Ruthless Podcast. Now, this show is known for its pretty unfiltered commentary, and believe me, this episode was a wild one. So let's just dive right in. So, this is how the hosts kick things off. They were basically telling their listeners to throw out any expectations for a normal show and just get ready. It's really the perfect setup for an episode that jumps headfirst into some crazy rumors, sharp media critiques, and political stories that are, frankly, just plain bizarre.
All right, first up, they got into a geopolitical rumor so out there that they gave it its own nickname. They called it the Gayatollah story, and it's all about Iran's potential new supreme leader.
So here's the core of it, coming from a New York Post article. It's this pretty stunning allegation that U.S. intelligence was briefing the president that Mojtaba Khamenei, the guy in line to be the next Ayatollah, might be gay. Now, you have to understand, for a regime like Iran's, that's not just a piece of gossip. That's like a political hand grenade.
But this is where it gets really interesting. The hosts dug into the details from this supposed intelligence briefing. You've got this nickname, the power behind the robes, claims that his own father was worried he wasn't right for the job, and that President Trump actually laughed out loud when he heard it. The hosts really keyed in on the fact that spy agencies supposedly found the claim credible and that the source was described as being solid.
So for the hosts, this wasn't just some funny, weird story. No, they saw it as something much bigger. To them, it's a perfect example of modern political warfare. The real takeaway here, they argued, is that mockery itself has become a weapon. Spreading this kind of information, true or not, to ridicule and destabilize your enemies, that's the new playbook. Okay, so from those international rumors, the podcast then pivoted hard, turning a critical eye on how the American media is reporting on these conflicts. And they really zeroed in on one network in particular.
This quote right here was Exhibit A in their argument. The hosts played a clip of CNN commentator Lee McGon, who, right in the middle of a discussion about the conflict with Iran, just came out and said it. We are the bad guys here. The podcast presented this as a prime example of a certain kind of anti-American bias they see in the media.
And this next example really drives their point home. So on the left, you've got this reporter's tweet. It takes what a general said about fallen soldiers and boils it down to this really cold-sounding phrase, bad things can happen. But as the host pointed out, if you look at the full context on the right, which came from a community note, you see it was part of a much more heartfelt tribute. For the hosts, this wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate distortion.
And they weren't done. They continued to build their case, arguing that there's a pattern of this kind of thing. They brought up the fact that CNN's London bureau chief went to a celebration hosted by Iran's ambassador, and then they highlighted an instance where the network aired what they described as 4 straight minutes of Iranian state TV propaganda totally uninterrupted.
And to kind of put a bow on their whole media critique, they played this quote from MSNBC's Joy Reid. The thing that really jumped out to the hosts was this direct comparison she made between social policies in the US and in Iran. They highlighted her argument that America is only marginally better and that both countries are basically driven by their own versions of religious fundamentalism.
All right, after all that, they shifted gears again, this time to a lightning round of some of the strangest political stories happening right here in the US. Just a whole bunch of domestic oddities.
Okay, you might want to sit down for this one. The first story is about Jack Schlossberg, JFK's grandson, who's actually running for Congress. As the podcast pointed out, he apparently keeps a life-sized skeleton in his house. But that's not all. He dresses it up in his grandfather's old clothes.
And if you're wondering why he does this, well, here's his explanation. He said it started as a thing to help with a back problem. But once he put his grandpa's robe on it, he realized, quote, now I can ask him questions and we can talk. You can imagine the hosts had a lot of fun unpacking that one.
Next up in the world of weird, they covered the changing story of a Senate candidate and his controversial tattoo. So originally, this candidate apologized for a tattoo that, let's be honest, looked a lot like a Nazi symbol. He even had it changed. But as the host pointed out, he's recently done a complete 180 and is now defending the original tattoo, calling it, and this is a quote, an eminently reasonable skull and crossbones.
This segment on domestic issues ended with this really, really pointed quote. It's from a judge's dissenting opinion in a Ninth Circuit case where a traditional Korean women's spa was ordered to allow biological males who identify as women. This particular judge, well, he did not hold back in expressing his disagreement.
Okay, for the final segment, the hosts zoomed out a bit. They started looking at some recent polling data and cultural shifts that they think tell us a lot about where the country's at right now.
The host highlighted this one single stark number from a major poll. Just this one number, which they argued is a sign of a massive political shift that's happening as we speak.
So, what is it? That number is the net approval rating for Democrats in Congress, but specifically among independent voters. And a rating of -61 isn't just bad. It's the lowest number the Quinnipiac poll has ever recorded for that critical group. The hosts basically described this as a 5-alarm fire for the Democratic Party.
And for their final topic, the podcast turned its attention to Hollywood, breaking down the new rules for what it takes to win Best Picture at the Oscars. They walk through these new criteria, which basically say that to even be eligible, a film has to meet specific diversity requirements for its lead actors, its entire cast, and even the story it tells. Their big takeaway was that this is fundamentally redefining what we even mean by artistic merit.
So, when you put it all together, from geopolitical ridicule to media food fights to just bizarre domestic controversies, this episode was really a snapshot of our chaotic political landscape, and it leaves you with this big question, doesn't it? In a world where ridicule is a weapon and outrage gets all the clicks, how do we even begin to tell the difference between what's a real threat and what's just part of the show?